and we are live. What is going on? I want to welcome you from half court. Today, I am joined by, for my money, one of the best beat writers in the business. He writes for the Detroit Free Press, covering the Detroit Pistons. He's also the co-host of the Pistons Pulse podcast with my man Bryce Simon, aka Motor City Hoops. It's the man, the myth, the legend, one of the better well-dressed beat writers too.
Okay.
I know James gets a lot of his
That.
credit, but Omari, you got some style too. Omari
I
Sankofa
appreciate
the second. How's it going, my friend?
I appreciate that. I appreciate that, Sean. And I'm doing great. I'm doing awesome, man. How are you?
Doing good, man. Doing good. Really appreciate you taking the time to, sit down, talk Pistons, especially, we were just talking before recording and just such an interesting, like fascinating time for the organization. And I mean, just, couldn't think of anyone better to sit down and do it with just because, I just got a lot of respect for your work, but also you've always just been super gracious and nice to me whenever I've been in person covering the games. So yeah, man, appreciate you and excited to talk some basketball.
Yeah, no, happy to finally be on here. I've been following you a bit before you finally made not your Little Caesars arena debut, but for me, that was the first time I saw you there. So it's
Yeah.
been great to get to know you a little bit better this
Yeah.
season, and a lot to talk about, obviously, too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's been fun to this has been my first season to go in person and cover and
this is your
I
first season. Okay.
yeah, this is my yeah, I've been doing coverage in the past, but this is the first season I've actually been able to do to get some form of credential and go in person. So that's been a
Okay.
really cool opportunity. So
Yeah, awesome.
yeah, it's really cool to be able to share the space with you guys for real because everyone in there does a lot of great work. But Omari, the team that is not doing some great work right now or over the lead, not to be too harsh of a segue, but a team that is
Yeah.
struggling, the Detroit Pistons, I believe since this time last year or ever since they traded Sadiq Bey, they only have 5 wins and I believe somewhere around 56 to 57 losses. So this season they only have 1 win since their home opener, which was the couple weeks ago against Toronto at home. Ever since, it's kind of been back to a little bit of the same story. Obviously, Cade Cunningham went down to injury with that knee strain, but the Pistons still, even when he was in the lineup, struggled to keep it competitive on the defensive end. Had that 47-point quarter in Houston, and it seems like it's kind of gone downhill a little bit from there. Um, if you were to have to describe this Pistons season in like 3 words or less to anyone, as someone who's around the team on a regular basis, as someone who's watched, most every game up
Yeah.
close or on TV, has been around and, been able to talk to players, talk to people in the staff, like what comes to mind? To me,
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but like I'm just from my end, the first word that comes to mind is just puzzling.
Mhm. I mean, yeah, three words, a complete disaster. 2 words, complete disaster. 1 word, disaster. It's just a disaster of a season.
Yep.
I think just from any sense, when you're in year 4 of a rebuild and you're 3-35, I believe it is,
Yep.
not even through the midway point of the season, and you're on pace for 70 losses, really, at this point. Probably more than that. I think they're on pace since that Sadiq stat you mentioned. I think they're 5-58 in their last
Yeah.
63, or maybe there's one game above that. But whatever it is, it's just been almost a full calendar year now of just losing. I
Yeah.
think that a few of those wins before the trade deadline, right? Like they won 5 games in all of 2023, and they only had a handful of those after a certain point. I'm sorry, they had 10 last year, but they only had 3, of
Yep.
course, this season. So just a really, really bad run of basketball being played. And before the season, they set expectations to be an improved team, right? Like not
Yeah.
necessarily we're going to be in the playoffs, but we're going to take a measurable step forward. Now that Cade's back and we've been filling out the roster, got rid of the bad contracts, and we're going to be in the conversation, maybe like how Indiana or Orlando was last season during that 28-34 win range. It's just the worst season in Pistons history. It's on pace to be one of the worst seasons just in NBA history, period. So
Professional sports history. It's
professional sports
crazy.
history. So there's just really no other way to put it. It's a disaster. It'll be very interesting to see when and how they begin to maneuver themselves out of this, because I think you have to do a full autopsy of pretty much every decision you've made so far that's led you
Yeah.
to this point. I always get questions on Twitter from people who are like, "This is Monty's fault, or this is all Troy's fault, or who should we blame for this?" It's like it's everybody's fault. It's from ownership to the coaching staff to the players to the front office. Everybody has collectively failed this season. I think that's the only way you could get a team that's performed this bad. It's not
Yeah.
one person; it's everybody.
Yeah, it's yeah, when people want to get to the blame game, the honest answer is all of the above. And, like when you get to when you like you said, when you reach this level, everyone has a piece, in the, in the puzzle, so to speak, and everyone has a role that they can play to, to control where they're at. And, it just seems like, especially watching a lot of these young teams that are taking those steps. Granted, I know people are going to look at like you can look at the fact that, Orlando and Houston, for example, started their rebuilds with more assets than Detroit did. And for a while, that was, like a pretty valid excuse, but I think the thing that strikes me when, like when I watch like in Orlando, for example, like obviously Paulo's great. And obviously like Franz Wagner's great. But to me, it's like it's all the young guys that can come in off the bench and contribute, and hitting a shot and defending, and playing both ends of the court, like knowing their role, being bought in to like what they're doing. And it just seems like as the season has gone on, it just seems like it's been harder for them to find those reliable pieces outside of Cade that can come in and give you that for 4 quarters. It just seems like they're it really just seems, they have stretches where they look where they look, relatively impressive. And then there's stretches that just leave you scratching your head going, What happened?" And it's almost the same thing every time.
No doubt. You mentioned the teams that have improved, right? Like all the teams that were in the basement in the last 4 or 5 years that have now gotten out of it. And I think just from a pure team building standpoint, those teams all didn't follow the exact same path, but they all, I
Yeah.
think, followed the general same philosophy of just building a modern NBA team. Whether
Yeah.
that's OKC, taking swings on guys that could shoot, like a Isaiah Joe, which was a big hit for them. I mean, I know they started off with more draft capital and this and that. Same for Orlando, but I think 3 4 years in, you can probably, I think that excuse fades into the background a bit.
Yeah.
But but OKC, they said we have Shea and we're going to surround him with perimeter defending and shooting. And they didn't
Yep.
even really have a big man rotation at all. Of course, they got a little bit lucky to be able to get, Chet, who's really plugged that hole for them in a lot of ways. But, just very much a modern view of what an NBA team should look like as far as having the rim protection element, the perimeter defense, the shot creators. They've honed in on all of that. Orlando probably hasn't honed in on shooting as much, but they've gotten a lot
Right.
of high IQ guys. You have Franz who can really shoot and defend and move the ball. You got Paolo, that was your number one pick, but they really went all in on defense. You have Jonathan Isaac, you have just all these guys up and down the roster, Anthony Black, that can really, really defend. And they've been one of the top defensive teams in the NBA now, and that's the reason why they're so much better. Jalen Suggs, and then you hit some of the margin picks too. Like I know Cole Anthony didn't have like a lot of hype in that draft, but he's been a really solid piece for him. Then you take a swing on a Markel Fultz, and I know he's been hurt, but when he's played, he's been really, really good for him. And the
Yeah.
Pistons just haven't really quite had that, I guess, role fulfillment. You look at the wings and fours they've had over the years that could shoot, like Sadiq Bey and Trey Lyles, who would fit on this team, I think, really well. Became too big, so we're not really moving the needle for you, and probably aren't long term pieces. And there's a lot of overlap between the guards. You've used first round picks on 4 guards, and at some point you have to consolidate that rotation. Bigs, you have Jalen Duren, you have Isaiah, you have the other 2 bigs that traded to wings for it. There's just a lot of row overlap
Yeah.
for roles that you don't necessarily need to begin with. You don't need 3 bigs to all do the same thing that Jalen Duren does to various degrees of effectiveness. And I think the Pistons zagged in ways where other teams have zigged, and it's honestly, I think, just caught up to them and backfired so far.
Yeah, for sure. And like conceptually, I know, ever since Troy Weaver's come in, the number one talking point of the philosophy of the rebuild is it is not a rebuild, it is a restoration.
Mhm.
Do you think that the Pistons have to maybe reconcile with the fact that the brand of basketball that that they were built upon. Not that defense, isn't important because just about every team that wins the championship is the best, is the best, if not one of the best teams on the defensive end of the ball. But do you think the way that they have gone about, like, because like you've said, from a team construction standpoint, where the league is zigged, the Pistons have zagged, and they've been pretty much doing that since the start of the Warriors dynasty when they went and loaded up on bigs at that point as well. Do you think they need to reconcile with the fact that maybe the restoration philosophy isn't the way to go, and that they need to maybe pivot to a more modern outlook?
I think you have to. It's one thing if you just fall below expectations, right? Like, let's say they're on pace for maybe the same win total as last year, right? You're on pace to win around 20 games, and that means you probably have, 6 or 7 right now. And it's not looking great, but you can at least it's not quite the disaster that you expected. And maybe at that point you can say, okay, we made a couple misevaluations and we have been hurt by injuries as well. Maybe some of those excuses become a bit more valid. But I think when you fail to the extent that this has so far, and I don't know how you can call it anything else. I mean, 3-35. I just don't think you can. Worst team in the
Yeah,
NBA. I just don't think there's anything you can do to really reconcile that. So I think you have to pivot. I think you have to, like I mentioned earlier, do a full autopsy of every position, figure out which guys you absolutely need going forward, and that includes the young guys, and which players maybe you still high on now, and just maybe get players either who are more established or other young guys who maybe fit the mode of fitting with the players you do keep, right? Like, hey,
yeah,
Cunningham's probably the closest thing to an untouchable guy. But outside of that, how many of these players are really moving the needle at that point?
yeah,
I don't think you can look at a 3-35 roster and say we have multiple guys on here. Who do we need to move forward with? There's probably only a handful, and you have
yeah.
to become pretty aggressive, I think, pretty soon, and uh, reshaping what the future of this team is.
Yeah, I think especially around the deadline, I think they're gonna have to be delicately urgent because, they when you talk about, like, what type of moves and how can the Pistons get better, I think around, I know around the deadline, the talk has mostly been, I know Pascal Siakam is a guy that's, been mentioned. I know reports earlier today, linked Detroit, vaguely to, DeJounte Murray, but I know, Andrew Wiggins has been brought up in, as a potential concept as well. But I think the interesting thing that, that Detroit finds himself in is, since they have such a limited amount of assets, and since, they are in the position that they are now, in order to go and make a significant immediate improvement, they would more than likely have to part with one of those players that they really like. And it's like, the question is, like, obviously I know a big thing that, Troy Weaver and Tom Gores have both really highlighted and emphasized is the importance of them having salary cap. But, the question is, like, how much are they actually going to be able to utilize that in the summer? Free agency is always a really, really competitive, tricky market, right? So it's going to be interesting to see, like, how much are they going to be willing to part with pieces that they really like, and players that they really love, going to the deadline. Because I mean, like you said, I mean, it's, they don't really have much of a luxury for time at this point.
They don't, and I think the other thing that also complicates that is just the fact that a lot of the other young teams in the league who are further ahead of you in the rebuild also have more draft capital to work with. So you're going to be competing for players who can make a difference like this season and beyond. But we really don't have any draft picks to play with. You can only offer one, and that's like as distant of a pick as it could get at this point.
Yep.
So that hamstrings you as well. And I think it almost forces you to, if you really want to make a swing for a player who's going to make a difference and not just, another margin guy, you almost have to include one of your young guys at that point. And I think just with this team having that positional overlap, it just like it makes sense. Like you look at down the road when they have to start extending some of these guys, starting with Kate this summer. You can't keep all these players one to begin with. You just can't. You can't extend 6 or 7 guys with a team this
Right.
bad. I don't think that really makes sense anyway. So
Yeah.
at this point, I think maybe especially for fans too, there's been a reluctance to embrace the idea of moving on from some of these guys. But one way or another, this roster is going to consolidate itself just because the bill is going to be due at some point, right? Young
Yeah.
guys are cheap for 3 or 4 years, and then they're not cheap anymore. So, I think like on paper, it seems like a downside to have to part with some of these young guys, but On the other hand, if the right deal comes along, then and you want to, like, I don't want to say speed the timeline up, but at some point there has to be some sense of urgency. I mean, the
Yeah,
Warriors are a game and a half out of the play-in, and there's a report today that they're ready to part ways if anybody except Steph. Like there's
yeah.
urgency, right? We have to get better. When does that kick in for this Pistons team that is in year 4 of its rebuild, and again expected to be much better than they've been so far? So, in a sense, they almost have to part ways with some of the young guys if you really want to get a player who's going to come in here and begin to change the culture around towards something more productive.
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, that's where that's where this, this spot that Detroit's in just becomes that much more, complicated and that much more difficult. I mean, if there is any piece of the rebuild that you can definitively point to and say, at least they got that right. At least they can say, through this disaster of a season, that Cade Cunningham looks like at the very least he can be an all-star caliber player in this league and like definitively like shown improvement and progress and pretty much I think he proved to be the player that they hoped he would be during that losing streak. But in the same light, in order to maximize that development and help him see that next level, you need to get the right pieces around him to give him a fighting chance, to not have to get this usage up to the high level that it was. Because I mean, in order for this team to even compete over the last month or so, I mean, Cade had to play like all but 5 or 6 minutes of the game, just at just about any time whenever they had to turn to their bench or whenever Cade went off the court, it would be 5 minutes and they could have a double digit lead turned to the other side for them.
No doubt. Yeah, I mean, I think if Cade is closer to the player he was in the 3 or 4 weeks before he had that left knee strain, then that means you got fantastic value for your number one pick. I mean, he was averaging, I think, around 28, 8, and 7 on efficient shooting over a 3 week span. And even before that, I mean, even before he started popping off for 35, 40 points every night, you just look at the splits from the beginning of the year when he was essentially carrying the offense by himself to, Monty making some adjustments, and then also the roster just getting healthier with Bogey coming back and Burks coming back and finding his touch. If you believe that even that player who averaged around 23, I think 7 and 6, but also with like really efficient overall shooting, then you feel pretty good. You feel pretty good about extending them this summer, especially if he can avoid being on the injury report too much more than he already has. And that does give you at least one piece going forward. And one of the best pieces you could have, just being a 6'6" guard who can do a little bit of everything. I think that makes you very malleable in the type of player that you can put next to him. But if there's another success, it's just the fact that and they'll be quick to remind you, but the books are clean. They have a very
Yep,
clean cap situation moving forward. Got expiring deals and Joe Harris, Alec Burks, Monte Morris, and then I think Bogey's only guaranteed for 2 million. So that's more or less an expiring contract as well. If you want to get involved in a salary dump, and take on assets, you can do that. Maybe
yep,
you stop looking at finding ways to be more competitive and just say let's just gather more assets so we have more opportunities to take these types of swings that we need. You can do that. Just take what you can get at the deadline and keep it pushing. There's still a degree of flexibility I think that could help them maneuver things maybe quicker than you might expect if they make the right decisions from here. But that's, I think, the big question, because a lot of teams have had flexibility and then squandered it, on pieces who haven't made that difference that they expected. So I think they're in a tricky spot here, but they
yeah.
can change things pretty rapidly if they nail the decisions from this point on.
For sure. I would imagine, and I mean, like I know Tom Gores has been pretty, transparent about it. I know Troy Weaver's been pretty transparent about, like the conversations, behind closed doors have very much been about every day about, uh, uh, Tom saying being on Troy every day to look at ways to, maneuver and improve the team. I know Troy was technically signed to an extension a year or two ago, I believe. And I know Monty obviously was brought in on the, at the time, the largest contract in NBA coaching history, currently now third after the Spo deal that was done yesterday. Do you think if things keep going this way, that uncomfortable conversations are had in the off season? Do you think Tom is, still has the, is going to continue to have the patience for, the continual, like development in rebuild? Because like let's say even if, like they take that next level and get better next year, it's more than likely still fighting for the play-in, right? It's still probably taking the step that they probably realistically wanted to take this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are comfortable conversations are taking place now. I think
Mhm.
that there hasn't been any change to actually take place yet. I think at least visibly. I know behind the scenes, the front office has, at least tried to take additional steps to have more of an on hands on deck approach to fixing this thing and just getting everybody on the same page. But there have been no changes as far as staff or obviously as far as roster yet either. Which I think those are the changes that I think onlookers will put the most value into, but also probably in the grand scheme of the rebuild are the decisions that will dictate which pace or which direction this thing goes in from here. So those conversations should be taking place now. And I guess really the main decision for Tom is Troy the guy or not? If you don't have faith, then I think that makes the decision pretty straightforward. But if you do have faith and you say, okay, let's just ride through the season and we will allow him to make trades at the deadline and figure out a way to turn this thing around, then that's essentially a vote for no change at this point, right? Which
Mhm.
maybe Troy gets the job done and things do change for the better. I mean, there's no way to know what the right call is at this point, but yes, I think those uncomfortable conversations are happening. It's just, will the direction Tom decides to go be a direction that not only appeases a pretty frustrated fan base, but also actually, works to turn this thing around. I think that's what they're trying to figure out now. And at this point, the team is 3-35. Can things get worse? Maybe, but they've
Yeah.
already allowed this to be the threshold, for what's acceptable on some level, right? So, as
Yeah.
far as when they actually get to that point, I mean, it's anybody's guess at this point.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I know, I've certainly been, like a big defender of Troy Weaver in the past, and I certainly, I personally don't really believe in like calling for people's jobs and things like that. But
Mm,
results speak for themselves, and definitely got to imagine that uncomfortable conversations. To your point, definitely got to be happening when you get to this point. As far as for I know, with Monty, it's a much more complicated conversation because I mean, he was someone who was just brought in. He was someone, I know Tom in the media call that he did earlier about I believe it was like a month ago at this point now.
mhm,
He I know at the time that he said that, really the blame is on me and Troy, Monty, this is his first year. He's just coming in and just inheriting, this. I know Cade came out on the Woj pod and talked about how he and Monty have really bonded and that they have like a trusting and close relationship. Um, what do you get the sense as far as, and I know just about any team that's going through this type of record is going to have some form of, off vibes or are not going to feel super happy each and every day. But do you think there are those hints of connection issues? Do you think there is still that command of the locker room, or is it hard to say at this point?
I don't think a team that has lost as much as the Pistons have, like I don't think any coach who has completely bought in, or the players have bought into, and there's the synergy you need on both sides to maybe eke out wins that you know you probably shouldn't get just on paper. Like I know Orlando, when they were super banged up with injuries, they still put off some really tough wins, and the Memphis Grizzlies have too, and they've had a lot of injury issues. Of course, they have some established guys in Desmond Bain and Jaron Jackson Jr., but there's probably usually a level of fight and perseverance you see that we haven't seen from this Pistons team. So at this point, I think probably the buy-in and connection and synergy you need to really compete in this league has not been established. Because if it had, this team probably wouldn't be as bad as it's been. I
Right.
think the interesting thing with Monty is that he just got here, right? So,
Yeah.
Tom, he even talked about it when he talked to us local media a few weeks ago that he doesn't blame Monty for this because Monty, again, he just got here. He's not responsible for the roster and the decisions that brought the team to this point. Of course, he deserves some blame because he's the head coach, right? Like you can't
Mhm.
completely absolve the guy who's calling the X's and O's, but I think that kind of shows maybe why this is also a more complicated decision. Maybe it shouldn't be a complicated decision, but if you hire a new GM and you have a coach who just committed this much money to, that means you either need a GM that's comfortable keeping the current staff in place, or there's just however this a conversation has to have at that point. And I think that's what's curious to watch going forward. Is moving on from Monty on the table, or is it not, right?
Yeah,
If he's not at fault, then who does the fault lie with? Well,
right.
Tom did say, it's mine and it's Troy's, but there hasn't been any movement as far as, correcting whatever the issue here is. So, again, I just think that they're in uh, a really tough spot right now, and they're going to have to make before they could do anything on the floor as far as trades. I think they have to figure out just the leadership in place and how much confidence there is there.
Yeah, and I think they're getting to a point where they probably can't wait too much longer until the deadline, and I think if anything this time of year, I know a lot of people, have talked about, like, when's the change coming, like, why hasn't any change come yet? And, this time of year, when you look at the NBA calendar is always really interesting because, this is generally when teams tend to come to terms with who they are.
Mhm.
And like, for example, like you brought up the Warriors just a couple minutes ago. I mean, I think we're very much seeing a team come to grips with who they are and pretty much who they aren't, more like it. Teams like, I think teams like you brought up the Thunder, they're probably feeling pretty confident right now on their end. But teams all over the league. I've heard rumblings that Atlanta's pretty much on a full fire sale. I know the DeJounte Murray stuff is pretty much confirming that. I know the Nets are, kind of a team that was uh, kind of in limbo at the beginning of the season as it is, kind of trying to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to piece it around Mikal Bridges. Do you think part of it, it's just been, it takes two to tango, and just with how many teams are competitive in this league, it's just there's so few teams that are willing to part with pieces that Detroit would want to bring in? Because I mean, when you listen to like what are the problems that Detroit has? It's the things that are at the highest premium in this league, right? Like shooting and versatile defense on the wing.
Yeah, I think so. I think the thing with that is teams have been reluctant so far because, as you mentioned, I think teams are still figuring out who they are and where they fall into the hierarchy. But I think as
Mhm.
we get closer to that trade deadline, which is really under a month away now, it's February 8th. Today's we're recording on January 11th. With
Yep.
each passing week, we're going to see those talks pick up because teams are going to naturally hit the deadline as far as when they can pick a new direction. Like you mentioned the Atlanta Hawks with the DeJounte Murray. They've committed long-term money to this team that's clearly not close to contending. So you're at a point where you have to figure out how many of these long-term contracts can we part with, or what can we get for them, right? And that's where a team like the Pistons, suddenly those expiring contracts really come in handy, because at that point for the team on the other side, it's not about the quality of the player you're getting back, but just getting the flexibility to be able to further choose your destiny this offseason and beyond. You
Yeah.
look at just look at the bogey trade. The Pistons traded Kelly Olynyk and Saban Lee for Bojan Bogdanovic, and they got the better end of that. Like, they got the best player in that deal. For two guys who probably weren't going to be long term pieces for you. So those types of deals do come around, and I do think the Pistons will have those opportunities pop up more and more over the next few weeks as teams similar to Atlanta decide, hey, maybe we just need to hit the reset button a bit and not spend so much money on a team that's not competing. So I expect that'll pick up a lot over the next month. I think a month before the trade deadline is normal for talks to still be pretty cool before that sense of desperation kicks in.
Yeah. No, for sure. Omar, if you were to put your armchair GM hat on, if you were to boot up your PlayStation, go to my GM mode, and and hop in the trade machine and see what type of moves you can make. Are there players that you look at around the league that you personally look at and say that's a type of player that this team needs? Like for me personally, I even bring up guys like TJ McConnell, which I know is like a guy that is very overlooked and underrated in the league. I know guys like Tyrese Halliburton are very much like a key to their success. But uh, whenever I watch DJ McConnell, every time he comes off the bench, he makes some form of energy play, causes some form of turnover, makes life just a living hell for whoever he's defending. it seems to me like, if Detroit could have more guys that can both press the issue, but also bring that like veteran presence that this team needs. To me, like those are when I watch like Pistons like this, especially on the defensive end, it feels like they miss guys like that who just press the issue and cause issues. I know wings are definitely the premium and what
Mhm.
we need, but like I think a player like his energy is definitely something that Detroit could use.
I agree. They need. I think it's just two things, right? It is balancing the roster out. You're short on wings, as you mentioned. You're probably too deep at center and at the guard position as well. Really, ball handlers, right? You have too many ball handlers. You have too many centers. You don't have enough of the 2 through 4 guys who can defend and hit shots and just sort of set the table and make everybody's life easier. You really don't have that at all. So TJ McConnell, I think, really fits that mode. Really, like he would provide a lot of what they haven't gotten from Monte Morris this season, and
Yep.
he's expected to be back in the next few weeks. So maybe that kind of quenches their need for maybe a more veteran ball handler. But TJ McConnell, I agree, just the guy who could shoot, take care of the ball, pesky defender. A guy I look at, I don't know how likely it is that they could land a guy like this, but Andre Hunter, just
Hmm.
a bigger wing who could play some 3 and play some 4 for you, solid defensively, can knock down threes, and he's a little bit older on his second contract. Hasn't necessarily been in like an amazing situation, but he's made a playoff run with Atlanta, and he's been on some teams that have had success. Like that's the type of guy I think would really help this roster a lot. On a team like Atlanta, who maybe looking to get off of some of these contracts and not necessarily be as value focused, more so than
Yeah.
just flexibility focused. I know they have Quinn Snyder there, and I don't know how much the the appetite for a full rebuild is when you have Trey Young and you might be able to just retool pretty quickly, similar to what Dallas did with Luca this past offseason. So that's the range I'm looking at, right? Like not necessarily any small guards or genuine centers, unless you get a center that can protect the rim, which they also somehow don't don't really
Yeah.
have.
I think I tweeted like a week or two ago for a
Yeah.
team that, that has like 4 or 5 bigs, they lack reliable bigs.
Yeah, and that's just, I think a lot of the issues with this roster is pretty much encapsulated right there.
Yeah.
You tripled, quadrupled down on a position that's been, I think, devalued in a lot of ways over the years. I don't want to say devalued because centers are still really valuable, but you're going into an
It's
archetype of
definitely
center.
evolved. The prototype of the type of center that Detroit is brought in is not the center that we're seeing dominate the league today. I mean,
Exactly.
like
Exactly.
maybe the closest example of what you could see that is at that highest level is like a Bam Adebayo,
Mhm.
type comparison of what, of what Duran could be, but like traditional post players like Marvin Bagley and James Wiseman, guys who just get down to the block and say, "Give me the ball." Those guys are not at the pre at are not a premium anymore.
No, and I think we've seen pretty thoroughly from this season that that strategy just does not work. Regardless of what you thought coming into the season, clearly that's not a recipe that vibes with today's NBA. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's just really balancing the roster out and getting some of those, role players who fill roles that you absolutely need in today's NBA to compete. Maybe you give the Golden State Warriors a call and see what they want for Andrew Wiggins. He hasn't had a great
Yeah.
season. Maybe a change of scenery could be good for him. They're clearly in the mood to deal. Steph Curry pretty much said verbatim, like we need to, like we need to make moves. He's never
Yeah.
really been one to speak that forcefully about it. So there's going to be teams that have wings that can help the Pistons who are going to be looking to save money. So it's just figuring out who those guys are, and then if you can pry them away, competing with teams like OKC who can just offer 4 or 5 draft picks and not blink.
Yeah, 100%, like Utah and OKC and all these other teams that somehow have like 67 first round picks in their kitchen cabinet like it's nothing.
I would
Uh,
call OKC, like
yeah.
maybe they could use a guy like a Bogey. They have somebody, they're already close to a contending team and they have way more picks than they could reasonably do anything else with. You might be able to get a first from them just because they're boxed into a corner and they can't add 20 rookies over the next 4 years, right?
Well, Nick, if you think about it, it's pretty clear that like they can be pretty competitive right now, but at the same time, I don't think Sam Presti's like overly eager to push a ton of chips in the middle of the table.
Yeah.
Relatively speaking, especially compared to a lot of deals that people are talking about Oklahoma City making, if they went and got a Bojan, that would be significantly, more value, like, significantly like cheaper as far as like a compensation compensation packaged in for like a Lauri Markkanen or a Pascal
Yeah.
Siakam, and you still get a guy who comes in and really helps them in an area that they really need. I actually really like that fit.
Yeah,
Um,
they're in a unique position where, they could offer a first that has absolutely no impact on the bearing of the outcome of their future. And they just get a really good veteran wing and that they can buy out this offseason. And, or if you want to bring them back, you could bring them back, flip them next offseason. But to me, that's the type of deal if I'm the Pistons I'm looking at. If it's not correcting the roster, it's at least finding assets for some of the guys who can contribute now.
yeah, for sure. I think one of the players that's, obviously whenever you have a rookie, they generally become one of the storylines, especially in a young rebuilding team. And I think Asar Thompson, ever since coming to the league, he's shown, I think he's shown a lot of flash of exactly why he was drafted at number 5. But I think at the same time, he's also shown a lot of why he's a rookie and still has, a lot of room to grow. Do you think the stretch that he's going through right now, do you think one could describe it as a rookie wall? Do you think it could be, potentially be anything, more than that? And, like, do you where, are you concerned about his lack of playing time or, where he's been in the grand scheme of the rotation? Just because, I know for a team that, even though they're focused on winning as many games as possible, this season isn't necessarily going to be retrievable as far as getting back into playing contention or anything. So I know a big question from the fan base is why, why he might not be getting more playing time than say an Isaiah Livers who's struggling. But at the same time, I know the team talks about their needing for spacing. And when you have a guy like Asar who's only shooting 16% from the 3 this year, that makes it a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, I would say it's somewhere between the rookie wall and somewhere more. I would say a lot of his hot start. Uh, yeah, I mean, he was phenomenal the first few weeks. I think for a player of his archetype, he couldn't have asked for a better start. But he also has some games where he began to really pick up fouls, and I think as teams begin to solve him a bit more. I even asked us about Sasser a few weeks ago. Like, Monty just said they're not surprised in the NBA anymore. You had a couple weeks, scouting reports adjusted, and I know it's a defend these guys. And for a star, it's just play 5 feet off of them and dare them to shoot. And I think you couple that with just the fact that he hasn't been as aggressive defensively because he's trying to avoid fouls. He has his hands up more. He hasn't really gone for those same types of steals. So you combine his, I think, lack of aggression compared to early in the year, which is the rookie wall part, but also the fact that, teams just know to dare him to shoot and they almost completely ignore him on the perimeter, which I think bogs down the offense for other players. It's both of those things that have really cut into his playing time over the last month. And I think the other part with that too is that this roster just cannot really accommodate a wing that shoots as poorly as he does. But there's just not
Right.
enough to shoot enough. There's not enough shooting up and down the roster to really accommodate for that because you're playing up to 2 guys at any given time, especially with Isaiah Stewart out, that the defense could just completely ignore, knowing that the odds of them hitting the open 3-pointer are very, very slim. Even with Isaiah Stewart, they're comfortable with just giving him the 1 or 2 he makes a game because he doesn't shoot a very high volume. If he shot more like a Kevin Love volume, it might be a little bit different, but he should be getting more threes up. But all of those things I think are working against the Star right now. And
Yeah.
the easiest fix to it really is just for him to become a better shooter. I think, there's been debate. Well, the Pistons won 2 games early in the season with him starting next to Cade. But I think the counterpoint to that is, Cade's efficiency didn't really begin to pick up until you got more shooting around him. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. I think like you got Killian Hayes and Asar, 2 guys that defenses ignore, and they've been replaced with players that defenses don't ignore quite to the same extent. And you get Bogey back, all those things. And Bogey's return too, just that's minutes available at the positions that Asar plays. So I think
And
if
I know
there's
they've only won game, but I know they've only won 1 game since he's
yeah,
returned, but they are significantly better with him on the court than off of it.
yeah. Yeah, so it's all those things. Like Asar Smith still would have went down somewhat just because of Bogey returning. So, I'm curious to see long term, like what type of player Asar could become. Because again, a
Yeah.
guy with his defensive tools, just with his rebounding at the wing positions, which is extremely valuable. Somebody who can really pass the ball, but I think he's much better passing in transition than he is like in half court scenarios because he doesn't have to have his handle tested as much. He doesn't need to tighten his handle. It's just his strengths, I think, are good for teams that have spacing. It just need like that rebounding and defense and like transition playmaking. And the Pistons just need other things first, I think, before they get to a level where a star could like really plug some of those whole is for them. So it's a mix of a lot of things, like some of which is
Yeah.
on him just getting better, but some of which is also just the roster accommodating a player with his talent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think one of the ways, that could potentially open up, more playing time for him is if you were to have more, time to be maybe like a primary ball handler with the second unit, but you bring up obviously a guy like Killian Hayes, who's very much still been, like having a active role in the rotation. And, through about he's played 33 games, thus far. He's pretty much been he's pretty much been Killian Hayes that we've known thus far. Nothing is I wouldn't say anything has changed. I mean, his effective field goal percentage is about the same. He's shooting about the same from the 3 as he has his entire career. Like, at this point, I think it's pretty fair to say we know who Killian Hayes is as a basketball player, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I think once you get this late into a player's career, especially this offseason coming up, where you pretty much have to commit to him long term or be prepared to part ways with him. The clock's ticking, obviously.
yeah. Yeah. Do you have a sense of what potential direction, they could be deciding to go? I mean, obviously, I know Killian, I believe he said to the media the other day that he would love to stay in Detroit. And, I'm sure, especially that, at this stage, I know he's going to be a restricted free agent. But I know that, Detroit could potentially get him on a pretty team friendly deal if they chose to.
Mm.
But in the same light, with, like you said, the amount of roster issues that they have and the amount of clarity, that they need to find, is he one of the easiest, players to move on from, just because he is already coming off the books technically as it is, and it's already been 4 seasons.
Yeah, I think for both of those reasons, it does become easier to part ways with them. Especially like I mentioned earlier, you have to consolidate some of these positions, and when you have Cade Cunningham, Jaded Ivy, and Marcus Sasser, you feel pretty comfortable with those guys being your ball handlers. Along with somebody else who could plug that Monte Morris role, or Monte Morris, just giving some experience. That's just a lot of players, and is that the best use of cap going forward to commit to a guard? Granted, Killian does have a fan, and Monty Williams, and I think that's helped him this season. But at the end of the day, you can only commit so much money to players who have that skill set. And if you sign Killian now and you're not positive he's a guy who can really make a difference for you going forward, then again, I think even going to the deadline, you figure out, well, do we look to capitalize now, or what do we do? As far as this, so a lot of the decisions like are coming up quick for this team. So that's why I kind of
Yeah.
love to, looking at your young guys and figuring out, drawing the line and figuring out these are the guys we need to keep and these are the guys that maybe we could part ways with, because you have 3 wins, the deadline's coming up, and you're gonna have to start paying these guys sooner rather than later. And Killian Hayes
Yeah.
is probably toward the top of the list of face you have to figure out pretty soon here.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's, it's pretty looming, and, it'll be interesting to see too, like, I know Isaiah Stewart is a guy that they signed to, to an extension this last offseason. But in the
Mhm.
same light, when you talk about, like, what players on this roster have trade value, or what players on this team, do draw interest, from around the league. I know Isaiah Stewart is definitely one, that does. I know with the struggles on the defensive end, I'm sure they're going to be hard pressed to still, move on from him. But I mean, again, it's just, you talk about, like him and, Jaden Ivey's extension's going to be looming. You're going to eventually have to pay like Jalen Duren, like sooner than you think. Like these answers are like closer around the corner than people like realize. And, and even then they still have to make a lot of changes around the margins too.
No doubt. Yeah. I mean, again, for autopsy, I think you have to look at
Yeah.
every single element of this organization and, identify what needs to be tweaked. And there's a lot of things that need to be tweaked. Whatever recipe you had in mind has not, something's failed. The cake came out flat, or, you left the roasted oven too long. Something went wrong, right? So you got to go through all the ingredients and figure out how to tweak this thing, because it's tough to say at this point how many more years you have in front of you to really get this team on the right track. It appeared they were. If you asked everybody this time last year, is this team on the right track? I think a lot of people still would have said yes. And
Yeah.
this is pretty close to the worst case scenario. So yeah, you have to or like look at everything again, and I think really make some tough decisions here sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Last question I have for you. What have you made of Jaden Ivey's sophomore campaign thus far? I mean, obviously there was the, I think, you can look at Jaden Ivey's situation this season perhaps as like a microcosm of how, kind of like how peculiar this season has been, in the sense that he, started the season for about like the first month or so. I would say he was probably, I think he was at 1.7th in average minutes in the Pistons rotation. Now, obviously, I know he's worked his way more into the starting lineup. We've been able to see more of Cade and Ivy together, and I think we've the results of that have been statistically speaking they have been productive together. Do you think there's still confidence in building around that tandem? I mean, obviously, I know DeJounte Murray's name just came up today, and that's probably not entirely a coincidence, but at the same light, I know that Jaden Ivey has very much been in the plans up to this point. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think they're at a point where they want to part ways with Jaden Ivey, but I also think Ivey's in a position where he probably has to start showing some return soon to kind of lock in his future as a co-leader of this rebuild with Kate Cunningham and Jalen Duren. He's I actually just checked it. Ivey's played 34 games this season and he started 18, so he's actually not started more than half of his games this season. And I would say he's probably gotten close to the point to where, just from a pure minute standpoint, because he's averaging 29 minutes in his last 14 games, his roles increased. We've seen him more in the, I guess, quote unquote, natural role he would be in next to Cade, where
Yeah.
he's more off ball. Like, I know people will argue he should have the ball in his hands more as a point guard because it's not on the floor. And I think that that's fair, just seeing that he did play a lot of point guard at the end of the last season. But even with that, I don't think his playmaking numbers have been great this season. He's averaging in that same 14 game span where he's playing 29 minutes, he's averaging 4.4 assists and 2.7 turnovers. So that doesn't necessarily scream lead ball handler. And he's also struggled to knock down threes. So I think those are two things that have kind of hurt him this season. I think the upside is that he's a better interior scorer than he was last year. He's been more decisive,
Yep.
and I think he's finished at the rim better. But he also hasn't been that great at the line, which kind of negates his ability to get down the hill. So he's still got
Yeah.
some improvement in front of him. And a guy with his tools, I don't think you give up on a guy with his tools too early, because all of the things he struggled with are things that are correctable. But so far, I think Cade's by far been the best player on this team. And it's not just Jaden. Everybody else on the roster has to prove that they can be somebody who could fit with him and ultimately lift the ceiling for this team.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think you absolutely hit on it where, and I think, when we alluded to kind of like that delicate balance that they have, it's like, which players if you have to part with, do you feel comfortable doing so? Because this is an organization that historically has been haunted by the players that they have chosen to part with. Right. And, I think especially, a player with his skill set, with his, overall upside, his athleticism, things like that. Certainly a player that could potentially make you rue the day that you pick against them. But Omari, seriously, man, this was really fun. Thank you so much for hopping on. Where can people find your work, and where should people follow you?
Yeah, so you can find my work at the Detroit Free Press, which is freep.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Omari Sankofa, OMARISANKOFA. And then also check out the Pistons Post, our Pistons podcast with myself and Bryce Slyman, Motor City Hoops, and then also our producer, Wes Davenport. So still a lot of content being produced this season, despite
Yes,
the
sir.
record. And Sean, I mean, it's been a long time coming, so thanks a lot for
Yeah,
having me
man.
on here.
No, dude, thank you so much. Like I said, I have a lot of respect not only for your work, but just who you are as a guy. And we definitely got to run this back, man. This was a lot of fun.
No, absolutely. Anytime.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. And thank you to everyone that tuned in live or listening to this later. And thank you for making From Half Court one of your homes for not only NBA content but Pistons content. You can follow myself at Sean Half Court both on Twitter and on Threads. Although I still don't know how much I'm using Threads, because who needs another social media app? But you can also like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you're not missing any more content from Half Court. That's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll catch you guys next time from Half Court. Be sure you're subscribed.